Hello, everybody, and welcome to Yoshi 1 Kenobi's Top 10 Cards from Zendikar Rising for Standard. At the number 10 on the list, to start us up, we have Inscription of Abundance. Now, this 2 mana instant may not look like much, but you can kick it for an extra 3 mana to activate all of its modes. So it's one of the 3 inscriptions that we are getting with Zendikar Rising. And this is probably the most powerful one. So there's 3 modes. You can put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature, which is a fairly good combat trick for 2 mana. The +1/+1 counters will stick, and there's a lot of +1/+1 counter synergies, not to mention Mutate that's available in the format. That'll make good use of these counters. Target player gains X life. It's a useful mode to have, especially when you kick it. If you're in a tight position against an aggressive opponent, it's just going to be a bonus when you kick it. Very unlikely to be one of the modes that you'll use just when you're paying 2 mana for it, but options are options. They'll help you in a bind. And last one is target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, which is an instant prey upon, and paying 2 mana for that effect is just good value. So we have 2 modes with very good value that can act as combat trick or just plain removal in your big creatures deck. And then you can cast it later on in the game for 5 mana in green, which isn't very hard to get. And then you get the 2 powerful effects on top of each other and a bunch of bonus life. This is a very powerful trick, and it's going to see a lot of play. At number 9 on our list, we have Skyclave Shade. Now, this shady character only costs 2 mana, and it's a 3-powered attacker that cannot block, which is a downside. So it's a little subpar in just pure stats, but then again, a 3-powered attacker is pretty good. You can kick it for an extra 3 mana, so that it becomes a 5/3 when it enters the battlefield, which is very potent attacker. I mean, it'd be good in draft, but then there's the landfall ability. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if Skyclave Shade is in your graveyard and it's your turn, you may cast it from the graveyard this turn, which means that you get to discard freely your Skyclave Shade to something like a Rotting Regisaur or Demonic Embrace, which Black wants to do anyways, and then you get to bring it back for free. You just play the mana cost, and this card is as good in the graveyard as it is in your hand, which makes it a very good discard fodder for already powerful black cards. It's also a recurring threat in the late game. When you go in top deck mode, you draw that land and you go, I don't have anything to play. Well, now you do, because you have Skyclave Shade. And so it provides this recurring threat from the graveyard. You draw land, you play your Skyclave Shade. Skyclave Shade, or Skyclave Shades if you have multiple. Landfall will trigger on all of those. If you draw something that's not a land, well, you have something to play anyways. So this is going to be a very recurring threat in a lot of decks, so you'll see a lot of Skyclave Shades. And you'll probably have to exile them, because exiling is the way to get rid of them. In the number 8 spot on our list, we have Hagra, the land kill spell. It's a land, it's a kill spell. What can you ask more? So, early game, you draw this, your opponent has nothing in play. You see your opponent playing control, Hagra's Blood Pit is a land. That's going to help you feed your strategy and get some stuff into play. If you draw this in the mid to late game, you're like, I don't want to tap land, but my opponent has this big creature in play. That's when you start Mauling with Hagra's Mauling. It's a slightly overcosted removal spell, but we've seen 4 mana instant kill spell see play. We've seen like Vraska's content be main decked for a little while. So this is like a Vraska's content that you get to use as a land early game. Okay, it does not target Planeswalker and does not exile, so it's not nearly as good in terms of pure removal. But Murder is fringe playable in Standard, and this will be the exact same thing as a Murder if your opponent controls no basic lands. which is going to be fairly rare, but it's going to happen. You'll get the discount on Hagra's Mauling. It's really the flexibility of a pure kill spell and a land, which are two core things that you want in your deck, which means you'll get to play more lands and more kill spells and have the best of both worlds whenever you need it. On the 7th spot on our list, we have Shatterskull Charger. This little human charging to shatter some skulls with his 3 mana cost, a 4/3 trample haste, that's a lot of keywords, with the downside that at the beginning of your end step, if it doesn't have a +1/+1 counter, you return it back to your hand. But back to your hand is a downside because you have to pay the mana again to play it next turn. But it's also safety. And while Shatterskull Charger is safe in your hand, your opponent cannot exile it with Elspeth Conquers Death. Your opponent cannot shatter the sky to kill it. Your opponent needs instant speed removal to deal with a Shatterskull Charger, which gives you a different angle of attack against some of these control decks. Now, you can also kick it, and then it becomes your 5-drop, a 5/4 trample haste that'll remain on the battlefield. Also, there's a lot of +1/+1 counter synergies, so you might be able to get more out of that 1/+1/+1 counter. But just for rough stat value, we've seen 5-powered haste tramplers see play in standard, even when they're printed at common, like Charging Monstrazor saw play in some decks. We've also seen Reality Smasher do all sorts of smashing, and so the Shatterskull Charger is going to do all sorts of shattering, except being shattered itself in disguise, because it's on the ground and bounces back to your hand to safety. Which makes it our 7th best card from Zendikar Rising. In the number 6 spot, we have Legion of Angels. Legion Angels, the Angel Warrior for 4 mana, a 4/3 flyer, which is already pretty good stats. I mean, we've seen Sphinx of Foresight see play with these stats, mostly for the scrying effect, but it's still a decent attacker. But when it enters the battlefield, you get to reveal a Legion Angel from outside the game, so from your sideboard, and put it into your hand. So you can consider this as a 4/3 flyer for 4 that draws you a relevant card, which is worth a lot. You can consider it as drawing like 1.2, maybe 1.4 cards, and you'll have a very big stream of Legion Angels. Now, this card is a 1 or 2 of in your deck, because you'll want to have a couple of copies in your sideboard for maximum value. But if you play just 1, for example, then it's a 4/3 flyer draw card that brings back a 4/3 flyer that draws a card, that brings back a 4/3 flyer that draws a card, for very little opportunity cost of playing a single copy in your deck. If you play 2 copies, then you'll have access to 2 more and more chances of drawing it, which I think is a sweet spot for this card. But basically, you include 1 or 2 copies of those in your deck, and for best of 1, it's almost free unless you're playing Fae of Wishes, in which case it's just a couple of wishboard slots, which you can afford anyways, for a legion of flying killing machines that fight with 2 swords, or spears, a sword and a spear. Anyways, it doesn't matter, it's going to beat down on your opponent, and that's all we care about for this card. In the 5th spot on our list, we are playing the Kazandu Mammoth / Kazandu Valley. Now, this is another one of these cards that's extremely powerful because it's a land, or a creature, or a land, or a creature, and the versatility of these cards is just amazing. We will see tons of those played across pretty much every deck until they rotate out, and you will see the true power of these cards, especially when the creature or instant or sorcery part is on curve. So Kazandu Mammoth is just that. So it's a 3 mana 3/3, which is a little meh for green, but with a landfall ability. And landfall brings it up to 5/5 until end of turn. And as you're playing green, you're likely to be playing lands for a fair number of turns, which means that you should consider this as a 5/5 on the attack, at the very least, if not a 7/7. If you play a Fabled Passage, for example, crack it, go fetch a mountain. Kazandu Mammoth is now a 7/7. And why are you fetching a mountain? Because you want to Embercleave. And suddenly, this is a Rotting Regizor without the downside, with an upside of having access to playing it as land. The Fabled Passage is not included. You'll have to actually draw it or play it. But there's other ways to bring it up to multiple ticks of power, and it's going to go great in the landfall aggressive strategies. It's going to go great in your green Stompy as just a 5/5, kind of a love-struck beast that can attack without the restriction, or that you can play with a land. Overall, just very versatile, very powerful, on curve, does exactly what you want. On the number 4 spot, we have Omnath, Locus of Creation. Now this is a 4 mana 4/4, and the mana cost is a little restrictive. It's red, green, white, blue. But it's not as restrictive as it looks. In particular, with the new dual lands we are getting, it's relatively hard to hit triple of a color, or a 2/2 pairing. Something like green, green, blue, blue for Frilled Mystic is kind of hard because your lands are only going to tap for one color. But you get to pick the colors, which means that getting access to one symbol of many different colors is going to be fairly easy with these lands. So I don't think the mana cost of them is that restrictive. Now, what do we get for that cost? We get a 4/4 body, which is pretty good. That replaces itself because you draw a card, so it's already a good card if you stop at that line of text. But let's keep on reading. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 4 life. Alright, maybe veto shenanigans. 5 color life gain veto stuff. Nah, that's not what we really care about for this card. What we care about is next line of text. The second time this ability resolves, add red, green, white, blue. You play Fabled Passage, you crack it, and you get the mana back. So you've gotten really a free 4/4. It's a 4/4 that replaced itself because you drew a card, and the mana replaced itself because you get back the full mana that you paid, which makes it kind of Fires of Invention on the turn you play it, which happens to be turn 4. Well, I guess turn 5 if you want to play a Fabled Passage off of it. And if it's the third time you deal 4 damage to each opponent Planeswalker, the third landfall trigger is going to rarely happen, and the payoff's not that big. Unless your opponent has a board full of Planeswalker, in which case it's going to be devastating. But the real reason why we play this is for the second trigger, to get that 4 mana back. And as we've seen, cheating on mana, not a big problem. See Wilderness Reclamation, Fires of Invention. Omnath might get in that same category, where if you keep it on the board, then on the next turn, you're going to have access to an extra 4 mana if you manage to put 2 lands on the battlefield, which again isn't that hard. We have access to Fabled Passage, we have access to Uro, and these are cards that are played in almost every deck that are playing green and blue anyways. So Omnath, Locus of Creation, is going to be tearing up some boards in the very near future near you. And the number 3 spot, we have Felidar Retreat. Or should I say, Felidar's Retreat of the Field of the Dead. It's a 4 mana enchantment, and whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token. And you also have the other option. You can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn. Now, back the last time we saw Zendikar, we had Retreat to Myria, which would put 1/1 tokens into play, or give them +1/+1 until end of turn. And that card was quite powerful and saw some standard play. This puts 2/2s on the battlefield, and puts +1/+1 counters on them. Not just until end of turn, just permanently. Which makes it ridiculously powerful. I mean, this is the effect of Field of the Dead, except you get to cast it on turn 4. Yes, it's more prone to removal. Yes, you need to actually pay the mana to cast it. But it's still the Field of the Dead type of effect, which control players can now play this instead of the Shark Typhoon, and just, I'm playing lands and they'll win the game for me, because that's what this card does. It makes lands do all the work for you. You want to play lands anyways? Great! They help you cast stuff, and they make an army of cat beasts. Look for cat beasts in the meme coming near you. Maybe Cast Beast Zombies should be a good meme? Anyways, I'm sure you'll start seeing them, hating them, and playing them in a very near future. In the number 2 spot on our list, we have a little change of pace. We have a 4 mana 4/4 flyer. And first of all, again, very powerful stats. And 4/4 flying dragons. What's not to like? With a very unique ability, you don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end. So you get to keep your mana across turns. When Leyline Tyrant dies, you may pay any amount of red mana, and when you do, it deals that much damage to any target. So it's good on turn 4 because it's right on curve, solid stats. It's going to help you basically keep your mana turn over turn, which again is a fairly powerful effect. You get to keep over that leftover mana, and you also get to play it as a timed nuke. So you just keep on all of your red mana, and if your opponent can't exile it and has to kill it at some point, well, you just blow up all your mana to your opponent's face and one-shot them. You had 2 mana accumulated, kill off a creature. You had 10 mana accumulated, kill off an opponent. What's not to like in this 4/4 flying creature? They'll no longer get bounced because Teferi has rotated out and has been banned too. So I guess it's a double whammy. This card is now going to live. Or even if it dies, it blows up stuff. It's just awesome. And now it's time for the number 1 spot. The number 1 spot, as you've all guessed it, is Agadim's Awakening, or Agadim's the Undercrypt. So basically, these lands where you pay 3 life, they come in untapped, or you can play them as tap lands. So their Super Shock monocolored lands are extremely powerful because there's almost no opportunity cost to play them, and there's very powerful effects. I have included some of the other lands that have the same effect, but they all pretty much make the top 10 list, and they're all very powerful, but I wanted to limit myself to one. And I think Agadim's Awakening is the strongest one of the bunch. If we look at the effect, it's reminiscent of Command the Dreadhorde, which would be a 6 mana revive everything, except that this card doesn't kill you. So instead of having a downside that kills you, you have an upside that it's a land early on, so you can play 4 copies of it, and you'll have it, you're likely to have one in late game, and early game it's just going to be your mana fixing, so it does the best of both worlds. And what it does is it returns from a graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creatures that each have a different converted mana cost, and that's a slight restriction. But if you build your deck to have 2 copies of, 3 copies of a bunch of things, you're going to very likely be able to cast it for 7 or 8 and win the game on next turn, or win the game outright. If in particular this is going to combo very nicely with Terror of the Peaks. Revive a Terror of the Peaks, Croxa, and a couple of other things, boom! You win. It's as simple as that. And it's almost free to include in your deck. So it's time to pack up some graveyard hate because Agadim's Awakening is going to be available everywhere, and so will Uros. And the shade we talked about as our number 9 spot today. So, Agadim's Awakening, it's free to play. Awesome to play. Will win the game for you. Is going to make sure you hit lands on turn. And don't sleep on these lands. They're mythic for a reason, and they're very powerful. I hope you've enjoyed this top 10 from Zendikar Rising. Please leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Which cards do you think I've missed from the list and should have been included? Do you think the lands are as powerful as I think they are? Do you disagree with some of my picks? Let me know and let's have a discussion in the chat. I just want to keep on talking about those. See your opinions and see which cards you'd like to see in future videos. I'm really excited to play rogues, personally, and equipment type decks. But we'll see when the set comes out. We'll see what your preferences are. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe by clicking the Yoshi icon at the right of your screen. It doesn't cost you any mana, and it greatly helps to support this channel and keep the awesome videos coming.